You're listening to Season 2 of Medscape's In Discussion series on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a podcast where thought leaders and clinical experts share their diverse insights and practical ideas for optimizing patient care. This series is hosted by Dr. Jeff Swigris, pulmonologist and professor of medicine in the Center for Interstitial Lung Disease at National Jewish Health in Denver, Colorado. Dr. Swigris specializes in the clinical care of patients with interstitial lung disease and directs research centered on how interstitial lung disease affects how patients feel and function in their daily lives, how to best measure those effects, and how quality of life may be improved for patients suffering from interstitial lung disease. Relevant disclosures can be found with the episode show notes on Medscape.com or the Medscape app. The topics and discussions are planned, produced, and reviewed independently of advertisers. This podcast is intended only for you as healthcare professionals.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jeff Swigris. Welcome to Season 2 of the Medscape In Discussion podcast series on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Today, we're going to be discussing idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, or IPF, patient advocacy groups. And we have a wonderful guest with us today, Scott Staszak. Scott is the Chief Executive Officer for the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. Welcome to Medscape In Discussion podcast, Scott.
Thank you, Jeff.
Before we get into our topic for today, can you talk to us about what drew you to patient advocacy and to pulmonary fibrosis in particular?
Certainly. So in my 20s, I had a career in social work, but suffered burnout, as many people do. And so I shifted into a career in finance, but I was always mission-driven, so I started working in nonprofit organizations. I had spent time in arts and culture at a large historical museum in Chicago, and I also taught at the School of the Art Institute in a management program for arts administration and policy. So I was recruited to come to the foundation to somewhat professionalize the staff. I had no experience working with patient advocacy organizations previously, and like many of the patients who are diagnosed, I was unaware of pulmonary fibrosis. So about 3.5 years into my time at the foundation, my mother amazingly was diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So I didn't have a personal connection as far as the reason I came to the PFF, but certainly because of that shared experience with my mother, it has kept me close to the organization and has better informed how I do my work and the experience that patients, family members, and caregivers all have.
What an amazing story. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Because we know one another and have worked together, at least I've worked with the foundation before, you know my research interest is in trying to better understand how pulmonary fibrosis affects patients from a patient advocacy standpoint and from your position at the PFF. Can you talk to the audience about what you see as the main ways IPF affects patients?
Certainly. So from a physical perspective, the things that affect them the most are breathlessness, cough, and fatigue. Cough is interesting because it can be extremely debilitating in some patients to the point where they halt activities, stop doing things that they would have done in their normal lives. Whereas with some other patients, it doesn't really affect them until a much later advanced stage of the disease. So when it is present, it can be a very rough road for them, particularly during the pandemic, when cough turned into a virus that could actually kill people. Going out and about in public and having a cough related to your pulmonary fibrosis was almost like being a pariah. Now, beyond the cough, the breathlessness, many patients describe it as trying to breathe through a cocktail straw. So you can imagine the anxiety that creates when you feel you can't get enough air into your lungs. And then additionally, fatigue, because you're not getting enough oxygen or you're having a lot of anxiety, perhaps depression, fatigue sets in. And so a lot of patients find themselves reducing their activities in their normal lives because of it. So it becomes almost a self-perpetuating problem for them. These physical ailments result in these decreased activities, which then lead to depression. Additionally, some patients beyond idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis that have interstitial lung disease due to other diseases, they may have other disease symptoms that they're dealing with on top of all the things I just mentioned. The physical effects, as I mentioned, create this depression and anxiety, but also you have to think about what patients are told when they're diagnosed or what they find on the internet when they're diagnosed. They're hearing a message of you've got 3 to 5 years to live. And so that creates significant anxiety and depression for them.
Thank you for sharing that. One of the things that you and I and others in our field worry about is the misinformation out there, and taking information that patients and loved ones find online and assuming that that's gospel truth, when it's usually much, much more nuanced than that. And I can imagine that you find one of the most important missions of patient advocacy groups is truth-telling and making sure that there is not misinformation out there, that patients have access to really truthful information, vetted information, trustworthy information. And obviously, the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation is one place where they can find such information.
Yeah, we're almost like mythbusters in one way. The difference between patient advocacy organization and just general information that they may find on the internet is that we work with medical professionals such as yourself and others who have disease expertise. So all of the content that we create is vetted through those individuals, people who deal with the disease day in, day out. So there's an accuracy and a validity to the information that we've created. And many patient advocacy organizations do the same thing as us in their disease spaces. And that's why it's so important to go to that trusted resource. We're ensuring that more than a single voice is creating that content. Sometimes there'll be discussions about what's the appropriate way to phrase something or convey a message. We try to ensure that there's not too much scientific gobbledygook so that the average person can understand what's being presented to them and it doesn't create more confusion for them.
And enlisting the help of patients and caregivers to actually create the content so that we can ensure that we are producing things that are comprehended as intended by patients and their caregivers is really important.
Absolutely. We have strong relationships with patients and we engage them quite proactively in all of our activities to ensure that they're being represented, their voice is there, and the things that we're building for them are resonating.
So we talked a bit about education and trustworthy resources. Talk to us about other things that patient advocacy groups can provide for patients.
Sure. Many times when patients are first diagnosed, they've never heard of the disease. They don't know anyone who has the disease. And so they feel very isolated and alone. Patient advocacy groups, good ones, typically have a support group network. The PFF has 150 support groups across the United States, including some virtual groups. And so it's really important for patients to find their tribe, so to speak. I recognize that some people may not feel comfortable being in a group setting and speaking about themselves, but I strongly urge patients and family members, caregivers to engage in support groups. When you find others who are living similar experiences as you, it somewhat demystifies the experience. We can't mitigate or reduce the negative impact of the disease on people's lives as far as the course trajectory of it, but what we can do is reduce the stress and also the isolation that people feel from the diagnosis. So that's probably the strongest things that I would say any patient advocacy organization should provide to their patient community and along with the caregivers. Caregivers also have an extreme burden. They're caring for someone who perhaps previously was highly independent, and it can create a lot of stress in a household. Caregivers don't want to voice that stress or that concern to the patient because they feel the person's already going through too much. So they also need someone to speak to and have those shared experiences. Additionally, the PFF, we do community walks. There's 6 cities that we do that in the United States, and then we have virtual walks. And although those are meant to be fundraising activities for the foundation, I think people should look at it well beyond fundraising. We love it when people help support the mission of the foundation by raising funds, but that's not really the main point of it. Having community and allowing people to gather and assemble and get to know one another. Again, just like the support group, many people who come to the walks have never spoken with another person who has pulmonary fibrosis. And so that sense of community that gets created from coming to a community event is highly important.
Absolutely. Those community events, support groups, as you touched on, those are opportunities that patients and caregivers can take advantage of to alleviate the isolation, to remind them that they're not alone, to remind them that other folks are going through many of the same challenges. They can learn about the disease, learn about some tips and tricks of living with a chronic condition and so forth. So it's so important. Education, community, social interactions, all very important.
I would also want to cite just a couple other things that are really important that we have. So as you're aware of the PFF, we have the PFF Help Center. That is a place where patients, caregivers, family members can call into the foundation, or if they're unable to call in, they can send an email. But that is staffed with individuals who do this full time. They're very well versed in the disease. They have a lot of interaction with medical professionals. And so when someone calls into the Help Center, they can get access to educational content. They may be dissatisfied with their current level of care they're receiving from the medical professionals. And so we can advise them on alternative options, perhaps one of the PFF Care Center network sites across the United States. Today, there are 88 of them. And so it's highly important that people engage with us, because additionally, once they get into our system, if they are willing to share their email address with us, we will then send them new updates, new information, research that may be happening that is groundbreaking, drug trials that are occurring that might be beneficial for them to participate in. So I would strongly encourage people to be proactive and engage with that PFF Help Center. And that can be found directly on our website, which is just www.pulmonaryfibrosis.org.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. Something that you touched on that I want to highlight more, and another thing that the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation and other patient advocacy organizations promote is research by way of actually funding investigators. Can you talk to us a little bit about the funding mechanism of the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, how it supports research in the ILD community, and maybe talk about some collaboration that have happened between the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation and some investigators like myself, who has actually benefited from data sharing from the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation?
Absolutely. This is one of the most critical things that we do as an organization. Although we're a patient advocacy organization, there's another arm to us that is strongly focused on research. And we feel that if we don't put energy into research investment, the needle won't be moved forward at the rate in which we all want it to. So we have a number of ways in which we invest or engage in research. The first one is a program called PFF Scholars, and that is a peer-reviewed research grant program in which early stage investigators can submit research proposals, and then they're reviewed by a panel of experts and scored, and then ultimately awards are given to those individuals. It is typically a 2-year award, and the intent here is that we provide kind of bridge funding or seed money to launch certain research projects that may be absent funding, and those individuals, by receiving the funds from the PFF, they're able to move the research far enough along that then they go and apply for perhaps federal funds. One of the things that I'm extremely proud of is that PFF Scholars Program. We looked and saw historical life to date. We had awarded approximately $5 million of funding to individuals. And then those individuals went on to secure funding mostly from federal grants to the tune of nearly $300 million. So when you think about like a return on investment, even as donors that give us money to fund these research proposals, that's a tremendous return on investment. And it allows the research to move further along. But it's highly likely that those individuals never would have gotten the federal funds if they hadn't been provided the seed money from the foundation. So that's a program that is really near and dear to our hearts. Additionally, in 2016, we launched a project called the PFF Patient Registry, and that tracked 2,000 patients across the US with data and blood samples and HRCT images. The intent here was to create a large repository of information that could be used by many researchers. Life to date, there have been well over 50 research studies that have used that data. And when you think about the benefit of it, if each of those studies had to individually recruit, the timeline that it would have taken them to do that recruitment would have been immense. Additionally, many of the studies never would have happened because they wouldn't have had the funding to go and do that recruitment. We do not charge academic researchers to access the data that's in there. Historically, we also provided at no cost statistical support to those individuals. And so they had a support system to help them analyze the data in their particular study. Along with that registry, we've also used it to work on a consortium called Prolific. It's a group of industry partners who are looking at therapeutic development, and we've taken the data and the blood samples, and we're looking at 12 different blood biomarkers. This will better inform how they develop therapies in the future and also better understand how disease progresses in people, etc. And again, by having this as a central repository, it expedites the research around this. Finally, with the registry, in July of 2022, we launched a second arm of the registry called the Community Registry. We were concerned that we only had enough funds to allow 2,000 people in that patient registry, and we only had enough funds to follow them for a finite period of time. So it excluded a lot of people. And when you're a patient advocacy organization, it's not a good look to exclude people from participation. We had many people come to us and say, hey, I want to join your registry. We said, well, that's nice, but we can't allow you in. So by launching this community registry, it's a system in which people self-report from the comfort of their home on a computer, and they answer survey questions every 6 months. Not only did it allow us to add more patients in, but it also allowed us to expand and include family members, caregivers, and lung transplant recipients. So that information is also available to researchers. And additionally, if the survey questions that we're asking of them currently aren't adequate for someone's research, it's a very mobile system and facile. And so we can create new surveys with different questions that haven't been posed to them yet. Those can be sent out to those participants. Finally, that community registry has been really useful because the drug development pipeline is the richest it's ever been in this disease space. When I started, and I know you have been at this even longer than me, it was a bit like crickets. There wasn't a whole lot of activity going on. Today, there's an immense amount of drug discovery going on. And so that presents a bit of an issue in finding enough participants in all of these clinical trials. So by having the community registry, we use that system to reach out to participants and help identify potential candidates for drug trials. And again, try to expedite and move those trials along.
You mentioned the registries. I'm going to make a plea to clinicians out there, to any patients or caregiver loved ones who might be listening. We can only make advances in this disease by doing research. And we can only do research through the generosity of patients and caregivers, by giving their time, by filling out our questionnaires, by blowing into the spirometer, by giving us their blood. Enrolling in a registry and participating in research not only gives the field an opportunity to make advances, it allows your patient and caregiver loved one to play a really, really critical role in moving this field forward and one day curing this condition and preventing it from happening. If you haven't signed up for a patient registry, please look into that, ask your provider about opportunities, go on the internet, Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation or other patient advocacy groups, and participate, because it is so important.
I have an additional comment on that. This is based on direct feedback that I've heard from patients and others who participate in registries. Again, this is a really harsh diagnosis that people receive. And when they receive it, they feel that their center of power has been taken away from them. And so, although participation in a registry can't alleviate fully what's happened with that diagnosis, it allows them to feel that they're being proactive and it gives them more hope and optimism than just sitting home and being frustrated about what the diagnosis means for them. It certainly is highly beneficial to move the needle forward for the research field, but also on a psychological basis, engaging is extremely beneficial to the mental health of those impacted by pulmonary fibrosis.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Scott. Last question for us. Can you give some examples you touched on a few, but give some examples of advocacy efforts and awareness campaigns that the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation is participating in or spearheading, or if there's any other patient advocacy group that you know of that are doing similar things in terms of advocacy and awareness campaigns?
Certainly. Right now, there's a tremendous effort around an act called the SOAR Act. This is a concerted effort amongst a number of organizations that all have patients who have lung health issues. And this is the Supplemental Oxygen Access Reform Act. This would improve patients' access to supplemental oxygen. It's a major campaign for us this year. We've been able to get it introduced into both branches in DC with bipartisan sponsorship currently, which is somewhat unheard of these days. The issue here is that when it comes to supplemental oxygen, liquid oxygen is the best way to have concentrated effort of oxygen coming to you in the most efficient delivery method. And because of previous legislation, the reimbursement rate was diminished so significantly that liquid oxygen has become pretty much unavailable throughout the United States. What that means is that many patients, if they want to have mobility, go to a doctor's appointment, go to the grocery store, visit a friend, go to church, whatever that may be, they have to carry a large number of tanks. That's not always possible for them. And so it creates the system in which they become tethered to their oxygen concentrator at their house. Again, that isolation. So the SOAR Act would increase the rate for reimbursement so that these oxygen providers would then be able to bring liquid oxygen into people's homes. Also, when oxygen is delivered and the devices are delivered to people's homes, there's an immense lack of training. And so this act, if passed into legislation, would also ensure that there would be adequate training from a respiratory therapist on how to use the equipment. So this is a highly important activity that we're engaged in currently, and we hope to have success by the end of the calendar year. Also, beyond oxygen, the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation annually advocates to our representatives for financial support for research to the National Institute of Health, specifically the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. That is the largest funder of research in pulmonary fibrosis. And so it's really critical that we ensure that they continue to earmark enough funds for that research. Also, via the Department of Defense, there are funding mechanisms available to researchers, and we advocate for those programs to continue to be funded. And so those are significant research activities that need to be funded, and we advocate for it, typically also during a Hill Day that we organize every year. And patients and caregivers, family members, we ask them to engage in those Hill Days because it's best for our legislators to hear directly from those patients and their family members.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you said that because, I mean, I sound a little bit like a broken record, but I'm going to make another plea, and that is if you have any interest in pulmonary fibrosis, if you have pulmonary fibrosis, if you're a caregiver, loved one, if you're a pulmonologist or doc who takes care of patients with pulmonary fibrosis or just wants to see access to oxygen improve in this country, please call your senator and representatives and ask them to please support the SOAR Act. And I would say this isn't just for pulmonary fibrosis. We know that millions of people in this country with COPD, with pulmonary hypertension, with congestive heart failure, and many other conditions need supplemental oxygen. And the only way this gets passed is to continue to promote interest in it, to make sure that our Congress folks are aware that this is vitally important. And sadly, our patients with pulmonary fibrosis are patients who tend to need the most oxygen. And so having access to liquid oxygen and better service is paramount to allowing patients with pulmonary fibrosis to live their best lives despite having the condition. So thank you so much for bringing that up, and I just make that plea. Thank you, Scott, for being here. We talked about patient advocacy groups, and Scott reminded us the importance of patient advocacy groups, from supporting patients and advocating patients from the individual patient level all the way through to a global broad stroke support for advancing the knowledge around pulmonary fibrosis, for promoting research, so that one day we can be in a position where we're curing this disease and preventing it from happening. Scott, thank you so much for being here. I so appreciate it.
Thank you. And Jeff, I just want to put in one final plug here on the advocacy front, since you just made a plea for them to do outreach. The foundation has made it easy for them to do that. So if you visit our website at www.pulmonaryfibrosis.org/advocacy, on that page, you'll find ways that we'll steer you to do that outreach directly to your representatives without you even having to write letters. It can all be done through the computer system. And once you put in your zip code, where you live, et cetera, it's going to track it directly to those representatives. So we tried to make it as straightforward and simple as possible.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Scott. Thank you for joining us. Please take a moment to download the Medscape app to listen and subscribe to this podcast series on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. As always, I'm Jeff Swigris for the Medscape in Discussion podcast.
Thanks for listening to Season 2 of Medscape's In Discussion Idiopathic Pulmonary Fibrosis podcast series with our host, Dr. Jeff Swigris. Be sure to look for more In Discussion episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Check out medscape.com or the Medscape app for show notes, links, and more information on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis.